Hey everyone, Nick Marzinski here at trappinglight.com. In my last Lightroom tutorial, I discussed the white balance part of the basic panel in the develop module. So I'm in the develop module right here. This is the basic panel, and I was talking about these sliders up here in my last tutorial. And in my next tutorial, I'm going to move down to discuss the tone section of the basic panel, which are these 6 sliders right here. And for me, and I suspect for most photographers, these 6 sliders are really probably the most important parts of the develop module in Lightroom because they give you the ability to determine the overall brightness and contrast of your image. That's really important. However, to really get the full benefit of using this tone section, I want to spend this tutorial talking about the histogram, which is this thing up here in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. The histogram shows how the tones in an image are distributed across the image, and in order to optimize your image, in order to make it look as good as you possibly can, it's really important that you understand how this histogram works. Okay? And so I'm going to spend the rest of the tutorial today talking about it. And to make my explanation of it really clear, I'm going to jump over to Photoshop because it also has a histogram palette, and I can play with a few sample images that will help you understand exactly how a histogram works. So let's hop over there. Okay, now within Photoshop you can see that this image that I've got right here is just simply a plain white image. I'm going to drop a color sample point on there, and you can see in my info palette right up here, this is number 1. It has a red value of 255, a green value of 255, and a blue value of 255. So it's as white as you can get. It is white with absolutely no detail. And I've also got a histogram palette up here. Now, if you're using Photoshop and you don't see your histogram palette or Photoshop elements, you go right up here to Window, and you can just click on the histogram right here, and this palette will appear. Okay, and this is a histogram. It's the same kind of thing that you see in Lightroom. And on this white image, the histogram that I'm getting is just simply this one line way at the right-hand side of the histogram. That's it. And that's Photoshop's way of telling me that all of the tones in this image are bunched up at this absolute white level. Okay? And we can do the same thing with black. So I'm going to enable the next layer, which is a pure black layer. If I go and look at my info palette, you can see right here that this color point has a red, green, and blue value of 0. So this is as black as you can possibly get. This is basically Spinal Tap album cover black. Okay, this is black with no detail. And on the histogram here, that line that we saw on the right is now on the left. So Photoshop is telling us at this point that all of this image's tones are bunched up at absolute black. So now that we've seen this, we can draw one conclusion from the histogram, and that is that this horizontal axis, this bottom axis, this left to right axis here, corresponds to tonal value. The darker the tone in an image, the further the left it's going to be on a histogram. With pure black at the absolute left right here, and pure white at the absolute right. So darker tones are going to be on the left side of the histogram, brighter tones are going to be on the right side of the histogram. So that's about as far as we can take it with just simple black and white. If I enable another layer, this one is going to break the image in half. So now we've got half of it black and half of it white. Okay, and on the histogram here, now I've got 2 lines. I've got one that's absolute black. So this is Photoshop saying, okay, a good portion of your image is really, really black, and a good portion of your image is really, really white. Okay, so that's with 2 tones. But using a posterize adjustment layer, I'm going to increase it from 2 tones to 5 tones. Okay, so now I keep my black and white sections. I still have a black section. I still have a white section. But I've also got this dark gray section here that I'm going to call a shadows area, a middle gray section that's right here that I'll call midtones, and a light gray section here that I'm going to call my highlights. Okay, and on my histogram you can see that now in addition to my black line and my white line, I've also got 3 additional lines for those gray values. However, and this is important, these 3 middle lines here are shorter than my black and white lines. So now why is this happening? Well, if you look at the image, you can see that a greater proportion of the image is black and white as opposed to being gray. Okay? So as a result of that, the lines for black and for white are higher because you've got that greater proportion of those 2 tones. Okay? However, these gray areas, there's less of the image that's this color gray than there is of black or white. And similarly with this gray and with that gray. And so because of that, because there's less of that image that's being devoted to these 3 gray values, each of the gray values is lower. Okay, so that's another conclusion. Based off of this, we can draw one more conclusion about a histogram. Okay, and that's that this vertical axis, this up and down axis, this y-axis here, corresponds to the amount of pixels that are at a particular tonal value. The more pixels you have at that tonal value, the higher the bar in this histogram is going to be. Okay, so now we know that we've got tonal values across the horizontal line from black to white, and we've got the amount of pixels on the vertical axis from none all the way down at the bottom to a high portion of the image up at the top. Okay, but there's more than that. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to increase the posterized adjustment layer, and watch what happens to the histogram when I do that. So I'm just increasing the number of levels, which is increasing the number of gradations of black to white. So as I increase it, now it's at 21. Now I've got 21 lines that are all across the tonal range. And I can keep going and increasing these number of lines, okay, as I'm adding additional tonal values. And if I keep dragging it up, eventually, if I drag it all the way over, I'm going to get to a point where there are so many of those individual lines that they basically merge together into a single continuous shape. But you can still see what's going on here. On this histogram, you still have a lot of pixels that are located at black, and you also still have a good number of them that are at white, with smaller amounts at the individual gray values. Okay, so that's the basics of the histogram and how it works. But there's more than that. Okay, what we're going to do now, what I want to do now is try a brightness experiment, and the easiest way to do that is to add a brightness contrast adjustment layer to my image. I'm going to just drag it all the way up to the top of my layer stack here. Okay, pretty simple adjustment layer. You've just got 2 sliders, one for brightness, one for contrast. This use legacy checkbox I'm going to leave unchecked because it allows me a greater degree of adjustments that I can make to the image. Okay, so what I'm going to try doing first is I'm going to increase the brightness. I'm going to just start dragging this over to the right, and you can see what happens. The image gets brighter overall, but on the histogram it also gets bunched up to this right hand side, which is exactly what you'd expect to see. At the same time, if I decrease the brightness, the reverse happens. Now the image is getting darker, and the histogram shows that by being clearly biased towards the left hand side, towards the darker side of the image. It's indicating that there are more pixels that have a darker tonal value than there are pixels that have a light tonal value. So that's how brightness works when you're adjusting brightness or exposure, is that it's dragging the histogram one way or another. It's either dragging it to the left to make it darker, or it's dragging it to the right to make it brighter. So that's brightness. Well, let's talk contrast, because contrast is a bit different. Basically, when you think of contrast, think of it as the ratio between your lights and your darks. Okay, the higher the ratio, the more of an image that's pushed towards the lights and the darks, the higher the contrast. Okay, and you'll see that when I increase the contrast on this adjustment layer, what you're going to see is that it pushes more of the pixels over towards the dark area here and the white area here at the expense of these midtones here. So that's how contrast works. Contrast pushes pixels towards the darks and towards the whites at the expenses of midtones, whereas brightness pushes all of your pixels one way or another. It either pushes them towards the left or pushes them towards the right. Contrast pushes them towards the edges in both directions. Okay, if I reduce my contrast, I get the opposite effect. So let's do that. And what you can see now is that the midtones here are increasing. The image is becoming a lot more gray. And if I push it all the way as far as I possibly can, actually let's use legacy. There we go. That's really what I want. If we do that, you can see that I'm really pushing it towards middle gray, and this histogram is shrinking. And eventually, if I drag it all the way down to -100, you'll see that now this image is just simply at 50% gray, and I just have my single line there. So that's how contrast works. It drags towards the edges, and brightness drags towards one side or another. Okay, so that's pretty much the basics of the histogram and also of adjusting brightness and contrast. So now that you're hopefully familiar with the histogram, here's a question I want you to consider. Is there a perfect histogram that you should be pushing all of your images towards, either inside the camera or in post-processing? Let me put that another way. Should all of your images strive to have the same distribution of tones? Okay? And the answer to that question is no. And I'm going to jump back into Lightroom to show you why. If that doesn't make sense to you, hopefully it will after this example. Okay? If you look at this photograph of my daughter, you'll see that the tones here are fairly well distributed across the histogram. There's a bit of a high area here in the shadows, but for the most part, they're all over the board, and they stretch all the way from dark to light, from one side to the other. So it's pretty well distributed. Okay, and for this image, that works. This was shot during the day with a lot of varied tones in the image. You have a bright sky, you have a bright fence behind her that's contributing towards the brightness. She's got some bright tones in her dress that she's wearing here. On the other hand, you have dark tones like the trees behind her, as well as the grass and the darker jacket she's wearing. So you would expect to see a fair distribution of tones all the way across the histogram. And that's exactly what you get. So for this image, this kind of histogram works. But let's look at a different image. Now this one was shot at night. Okay, and in this case, you can see that the histogram is dramatically different and biased heavily towards the darks over here. And that's exactly what we want. That's what I expect to see. Okay, I don't want, for this image, I don't want a histogram that's really heavy in the midtones. Okay, because there shouldn't be a lot of midtones in this image. Okay, let's look at a different image. This is a silhouette image. Okay. And in this case, there's midtones, and there's actually some fairly bright midtones because you do have the bright sky behind her, but you've also got a lot of bunching up on the left side of this histogram in the blacks, okay? And again, that's what I want. That's what I'm hoping to get because I want to silhouette my subject. I want this to be black with no detail, and in order to get that, I'm going to need to shoot and end up with a histogram that has this spike on the blacks. And so there's not really a perfect histogram for every image. In the last two images that we've looked at, they've been heavily biased towards the blacks, but it can go the other way as well. This is a monochrome shot that I took in winter, and the sky was pretty much white, and the ground was covered with snow. And in this case, we would expect the histogram to be biased towards the whites, towards the bright side of the histogram, and that's exactly what we see, and that's what we want to see. Okay, I don't want midtone heavy because otherwise, if I get a lot of midtones here, all this snow is going to start looking gray, and I don't want it to look gray. I want it to look white, which means that histogram needs to be over on the right. And this is another image. This is the final image that we're going to go over just to prove the point. It's an image of a white rose on a white or ivory wedding cake. Again, lots of bright tones, and what I would expect to see is a histogram that's heavily biased towards the brights, and that's exactly what I get. Okay, so the histogram is basically a tool for you that lets you understand the distribution of tones within an image. And the great thing about this basic panel here in Lightroom is that it has some very intuitive but very sophisticated tools to let you make very targeted adjustments to specific areas of your histogram. And that's something that I'm going to cover in great detail in the next tutorial. In the meantime, try and get familiar with how a histogram works if you're not already familiar with it. And I want to leave you with one final suggestion. Most cameras, and pretty much all of the digital SLR cameras, have an option in the menu that allows you to review your image's histogram on the LCD screen along with the image itself. So after you take an image, if you look on the LCD screen, not only will you see a small version of your image, but you'll also see the histogram that goes along with that image. If you have this option in your camera, I encourage you to use it. And it's tremendously helpful because it helps you see whether or not your camera captured a good starting point of an image that then you can later massage and post to become a very striking image, okay? And the more you look at these histograms, the more you understand how they work, the more you'll be able to look at a shot that you're composing and go, this is the way I need to shoot it. I need to shoot it so that it will be biased towards the whites or towards the blacks. And how can I do this, handle this in camera to make sure that I've got the best possible starting point for when I move into Lightroom, because that's really important as well. It's not just how can we cook this image to look great in Lightroom. It's how do we start off with a really good image so that we don't have to stretch it as much as possible in Lightroom to get to a result that we like. So get familiar with the histogram if you're not already. If you have the ability to review the histogram in your cameras, like I said before, I really encourage you to do that. Okay. Next time, we're going to be talking all about these sliders here and how they work in Lightroom and how you can use them to make a good image into a really, really great one. In the meantime, my name is Nick Marzinski with trappinglight.com. Thanks for watching.